Nobody at Roland Garros hands out belief for free. Not to teenagers. Not to qualifiers. Not to players ranked outside the elite circle who are still trying to convince the tennis world they belong on the same red clay that built legends. And yet somehow, somewhere between Rome and Paris, something shifted so dramatically around Alexandra Eala that the director of the French Open herself picked up the phone and called her personally. That does not happen accidentally. And the deeper you look into this story, the stranger and more important it becomes. Because this isn't really about a ranking anymore. It isn't even about a tournament draw. What is happening around Eala entering Roland Garros 2026 feels bigger than results. Bigger than a third-round run in Rome. Bigger than the stat sheets people keep trying to reduce her to. This is about recognition. Not public recognition. Tennis is full of hype cycles and temporary obsessions. This is institutional recognition. The kind that happens quietly behind closed doors before the rest of the world catches up. And when Amélie Mauresmo looks at a 20-year-old from Manila and says, "You belong here," the sport is telling you something. The tennis world saw the scoreline against Elena Rybakina in Rome, 6-4, 6-3. A straight sets loss. Routine on paper.
But clay tennis is deceptive that way.
Some matches are decided by scoreboards. Others are decided by reactions. And the reaction to Eala in Rome was unlike anything surrounding a player ranked outside the top 40. The crowds changed first. At the Foro Italico, Philippine flags multiplied every day. The chants got louder every round. Laban Alex echoed through matches that, a year earlier, would barely have drawn secondary court attention. Fans who had never watched a WTA clay match in their lives suddenly knew every point mattered. Then the players started noticing. Then the media. Then the tournament officials. And finally, somewhere inside the offices of Roland Garros, Mauresmo noticed too. That matters because Mauresmo understands clay tennis at a level very few people on earth ever will. 2 Grand Slam titles. Former world number 1. The first woman ever appointed tournament director of the French Open. She has spent decades around players who either dissolved under Paris pressure or transformed because of it. She knows the difference between talent and readiness. And what she reportedly saw in Rome wasn't just a talented player. She saw a player emotionally connecting with clay. That sounds abstract until you understand what clay actually demands from athletes. Hard courts reward urgency. Clay rewards acceptance. You cannot rush it. You cannot overpower every problem. You cannot escape discomfort quickly. Every rally becomes a negotiation with your patience. That is why so many aggressive players struggle there. The surface exposes impatience like a spotlight. And yet Rome suggested Eala was beginning to understand something essential about the surface at exactly the right moment. Look at the sequence carefully. Against Magdalena Frech, she opened with a 6-0 set, lost momentum completely in the second, then steadied herself in the third instead of spiraling. Against Wang Xinyu, she didn't survive the match emotionally. She controlled it tactically. Against Rybakina, one of the cleanest ball strikers in the world, she forced uncomfortable rallies, disrupted rhythm, and dragged errors out of a player who rarely gives them away cheaply. Those are not random flashes. Those are clay court indicators. And the timing of all this becomes even more fascinating when you place another figure beside her story, Tony Nadal. Because while the broader sports media was still trying to frame Eala as an underdog story or a feel-good breakthrough from Southeast Asia, something much more serious was happening at the Rafa Nadal Academy. Technical reconstruction. Not wholesale changes. Subtle ones. Higher net clearance. Heavier topspin. Longer point construction. More patience inside rallies. Less desperation on early winners. In other words, the exact tactical DNA that built the greatest clay court dynasty the sport has ever seen. People hear Tony Nadal working with Eala and think symbolism. It isn't symbolism. It is methodology. Clay tennis is geometry and endurance disguised as sport. Angles matter. Height matters. Margin matters. Emotional stability matters even more. And suddenly you have a naturally left-handed player from the Philippines absorbing clay court philosophy from the man who coached Rafael Nadal to 14 Roland Garros titles. That combination changes how opponents view her. It also changes how tournaments view her. Which brings us back to Mauresmo. The extraordinary part of this story isn't simply that she invited Eala into the Roland Garros environment early. It's the details surrounding how she did it. Private preparation access, elite-level practice arrangements, tailored hitting support, intentional emotional reinforcement. That is not standard hospitality. That is investment. And the reason it feels so unusual is because Grand Slam tournaments rarely attach themselves emotionally to players before they become stars. Usually, recognition comes afterward. After titles. After semifinals. After rankings force the sport to pay attention. With Eala, the emotional investment is arriving first.
Why?
Because the sport senses possibility. Not just competitive possibility. Cultural possibility. The WTA has produced dominant stories from the United States, Eastern Europe, Poland, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Japan, and China. But Southeast Asia has never truly had a sustained Grand Slam contender in women's singles tennis. Now suddenly, a Filipina is arriving in Paris ranked on merit, carrying one of the largest diaspora fan movements the women's tour has seen in years, coached inside the Nadal ecosystem, and improving visibly on the surface everyone assumed would hold her back. That combination feels new, and sports are always searching for what feels new. What makes this even more compelling is that Eala herself appears to be changing psychologically in real time. For a long time, her interviews carried the careful tension of someone measuring herself constantly against rankings, expectations, and milestones. Rome sounded different. The quote that spread everywhere, "I'm not playing for the ranking anymore. I'm playing for the joy," resonated because it sounded unfiltered. And athletes become dangerous when pressure stops feeling transactional. That's what Mauresmo appeared to recognize before most people did. Not perfection. Freedom. The scary thing for the rest of the draw is that freedom often arrives right before breakthroughs. Especially on clay. Because clay strips away illusion eventually. If your movement breaks down, clay exposes it. If your patience disappears, clay punishes it. If your confidence is fragile, the surface stretches rallies long enough for doubt to enter. But if a player starts trusting herself on clay, really trusting herself, the surface becomes something else entirely. It becomes a weapon. That is why people inside tennis are now quietly watching the Roland Garros draw ceremony so closely. Not because Eala is suddenly the tournament favorite.
She isn't.
But because nobody is entirely sure anymore where her ceiling on the surface actually is. And once uncertainty enters a draw, everything changes. Especially if certain names land in certain quarters. Imagine the psychological tension if she lands near Aryna Sabalenka, a world #1 openly discussing physical limitations on clay. A 20-year-old ascending player arriving with momentum, freedom, and a growing belief that she belongs. That is not just a matchup. That is a collision of trajectories. One player trying to defend dominance, another trying to redefine the geography of the sport. And maybe the most important detail in all of this is the simplest one. Eala no longer looks surprised by any of it. Not the crowds, not the pressure, not the expectations, not the stage. That change is enormous. Because before rankings jump, before trophies arrive, before deep slam runs happen, elite athletes usually experience one invisible transition first. They stop asking for permission to belong. Everything around Eala right now, Rome, the crowds, the Nadal influence, Mauresmo's invitation, the reaction across the tennis world, points toward that exact transition happening in real time. Roland Garros begins soon. The draw will decide the immediate path. But the larger story already feels underway. And whether Paris ends in the first round or the quarterfinals, one thing is becoming impossible to ignore. The tennis world is no longer introducing Alexandra Eala as a promising young player from the Philippines. It is starting to talk about her like someone who might genuinely matter on the biggest clay courts in the world.